Musk stands to personally and professionally benefit from his alliance with Trump, who has similarly complained about the extent of the government's regulatory oversight, and that might also serve the interest of Musk's business partners and his peers in the tech industry. Let's talk about this some more with Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, host of the Fast Politics podcast, and an MSNBC political analyst, and Roger McNamee, co-founder of Elevation Partners and a former advisor to Mark Zuckerberg. He is also the author of the book Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Good morning to both of you. Roger, let me start with you, because there may be some people who are largely unclear as to why Elon Musk and the connection between Peter Thiel, the tech investor, and J.D. Vance exists, and why sort of Silicon Valley and the tech industry, but Musk in particular, seem to have become such strong Trump supporters.
So, Ali, I think the problem at its root is that these companies are so large, with, in the case of Twitter, hundreds of millions of active users, in the case of Meta and Google, 3 billion each, that they believe they should not be subject to the rules of any country. And Trump is offering them a path to that in the United States. And it's really important because in the process of gaining massive wealth and influence, these companies have routinely broken the law. We've operated for the last 40 years in an environment where companies had a duty only to their shareholders. And when you tell a company there's only one thing you need to focus on, they're going to literally run over absolutely everything else to get to that one thing. And Musk and Meta and Google, Microsoft, Amazon, that is what they have done routinely. And the Biden administration, to its enormous credit, has pushed back on that using existing laws. Now, the challenge we face with Musk in particular is there are a set of existing laws that we're currently not enforcing that should govern his behavior. But for whatever reason, we've chosen not to go after the richest man in the world, presumably because he's the richest man in the world.
Exactly. Molly, I mean, it's kind of Roger's point is interesting. There are many of us who think that actually we should possibly have some new laws around social media and things like that. We're not sure what they are. We haven't discussed this enough as a society. But we're talking about existing laws. Musk seems to be all about not having existing laws enforced, and he's going to be holding some kind of senior government position. What could go wrong?
Right. And he also controls satellites. I mean,
right.
You know, space travel largely, chargers for electric vehicles. No, the man is a monolith. The thing I want to just say about tech companies for a minute is, as a journalist, we produced mountains of free content, right? Tech companies like X, like Facebook, they drove local news out of business, right? So now we don't have the local news that we need to inform people about hurricanes, about FEMA, about all of the things that people need. And instead, we have these giant companies where there is no content moderation at all. So there's no one is sorting through it to tell you what's true about FEMA, where you can get your financial relief and where you can't. So we are really at the mercy of these tech giants because the government never enacted regulation and never, put the regulation that was in place on these companies.
Roger, you have often made this connection. You have said that a democracy depends on an informed electorate, right? We think democracy depends on having the legal right to vote, but in fact, an informed electorate. And you have for years made the argument that social media has actively worked against that. And it's never been clear why. Part of it is just money, right? That it's just cheaper to spread nonsense. It's more profitable to spread nonsense because nonsense and salacious content spreads better than solid information does. But what's at the root now? With these companies having gone through the threat of regulation for certain years, it now seems like, well, let's get Trump into power and then no one will regulate us about anything.
Yeah, I think that is fundamentally correct. And if you look, the threat keeps metastasizing and getting much, much more dangerous. So with Facebook and Instagram in 2016, it was about using disinformation to suppress the vote of small groups of people within individual states. In 2020, it was about organizing an insurrection and about violently opposing not just the transfer of power, but also things like the pandemic response that the government had. This time, all of this is about essentially creating and maintaining an alternate reality in which the MAGA people can operate. Meanwhile, Trump and his cronies are out there suppressing the vote of everyone else by getting Democrats thrown off the voter rolls, by threatening people who were immigrants but are now American citizens. You see all this going on. And from the tech guys' perspective, they're all people who either want to live on Mars in the case of Musk or on some island in the case of Zuckerberg or Thiel. These guys aren't sitting there worrying about civilization. They're not worried about anybody but themselves. They're convinced that they will somehow be protected from whatever happens. The problem that we've got with all of this is, again, take Musk in particular. He is credibly accused of jacking the price up for the Starlink terminals during a flood, right? So you've got all these people in a state of emergency, and he's price gouging. But the core issue here is that he is a government contractor with national security contracts. There are rules that govern the political action of those people, and he is not being judged according to those rules. He's being allowed to do whatever he wants, and what he wants to do is to spread falsehoods, to spread lies on behalf of Trump, the guy he's supporting, who is in fact the guy who attacked the government, who gives him the military contracts that are the key to some of his businesses. And I'm looking at all this, and you and I have been talking about this for 7 years and going, excuse me, at some point this country has to stand up for democracy or we're going to lose it.
Molly, the problem is that I'm not sure everybody makes this connection between the damage that these companies can do to social media, to democracy, and how that affects their vote. In other words, I'm not sure anybody realizes, all right, we have an administration, Roger's been talking about it for a while, we have an administration that's actually using existing law to try and impose some guardrails around social media. I don't know that that wouldn't make it onto the top 20 of anybody's reasons to vote.
Right.
And so it becomes one of these things where we don't understand the harm that is going to come of Donald Trump and having no reins on the tech industry. But that might happen.
Oh, I think we're here, right? I mean, Donald Trump is, he's setting the table for something, right? Like this rhetoric about immigrants is going somewhere, right? And you saw those people with the signs that said mass deportation now.
Yep.
That's going somewhere, right? He said he's going to rule as an autocrat. So let's do, fake crisis, mass deportation now, guy who's going to run as an autocrat. Like, history has shown us how this works.
That ends badly. And that's a good point, Roger. Elon Musk is surprising to some. They may not know all the things about his money and his influence and his contracts. They know. I mean, you just have to hang around on X a little while because he has some algorithm that makes sure everybody sees everything he ever posts. It's some crazy stuff, Roger. In the past, we've talked about perhaps nefarious goals by people who don't seem outwardly nefarious. So Musk has dropped that mask of being a normal guy who likes democracy.
Well, and interestingly enough, he is a person who, at least with his brother at one time, joked or perhaps were serious about the fact that they may have come into the country illegally, right? And it is an interesting fact that the people we're talking about, which include Musk, but also Thiel and the head of Fox News, are all people who came to America and got American citizenship. And yet the very ideas that they are espousing are about pulling the ladder up on everyone else who would love to come to America and be part of this extraordinary experiment. And I look at all of this, and the key thing with Musk is that he has shown you, he's essentially shown you what Silicon Valley's been about for at least the last 8 years. And he's showing it to you without any disguise. And we're sitting there acting as though there's nothing we can do about it, which is ridiculous. There are a zillion things we can do about it. And the key thing is, yesterday I saw Peter Baker on MSNBC, who was talking about the fact that, they can't really worry about the things Trump does because it doesn't affect his voters. I'm going, well, wait a minute. What about the 40% of Americans who don't normally vote?
Right.
Aren't we supposed to ensure that they understand that, hey, maybe you don't vote this time, but that means you're probably not voting again? And I look at all of what's going on, and I just go, we really should have a sense of urgency here. And
Yes.
I think Molly very, very, very thoughtfully characterized that a moment ago. The things they're telling us are not talk.
Yes.
They are a plan.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
the Silicon Valley guys are in on it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, you have both been yelling about this from the top of the mountain, so I hope people listen to it. Thank you to both of you. Molly Jong-Fast is a special correspondent from Vanity Fair and MSNBC analyst and the host of the Fast Politics podcast. Roger McNamee is a co-founder of Elevation Partners, former advisor to Mark Zuckerberg, and author of the book Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe.